Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Low Productions Values Sphere podcast, which is a shot from my terrorist hideout in Syria, where I have just been named Minister of Information.
I was going to say, now you're the legitimate government hideout in Syria. So.
Yes, exactly. This is the new Ministry of Religious Liberty. Well, all joking aside, I'm very happy to have Lyman here with me, and this could possibly be the easiest interview in the history of this podcast, the very long history of this podcast, because I told this story in the newsletter. You and I had been following each other on Twitter for a long time, and then we were at a conference together, and I watched you speak, and then we met and we got along, but watching you speak, I think I described it as like hearing an AI talk, just spitting out facts about your area of research, which is a relatively niche or considered relatively niche, but is actually extremely important area, which is demographics and specifically fertility, birth rates, natalism. Or you may describe it better,
No,
but
that's right.
and so I really wanted to have you on because it was great to hear you talk, and it's an important topic that's not covered enough. So I guess I'm going to start by asking, many people know this by now because of Musk and because of how bad the numbers are. But the first question is, how bad is it? Explain why fertility numbers have been plummeted and how it's all around the world and how it's really dramatic.
So, these days you do hear a lot more about low fertility, pronatalism, stuff like that. And sometimes I get asked, like, why? Why are we hearing about this now? And the answer is what you said, because the news is following events, right? So, fertility has fallen sharply all over the place. Um, I don't think it's surprising to people when you say, oh, fertility's falling really, really rapidly in Ethiopia. They're like, well, that's just because of some modernization process. Okay. But then people are more surprised when you say it's fallen by half a child in Korea in 15 years. When you say, oh, it's fallen by half a child in Finland in 15 years, these kinds of things. We do see a big decline across lots and lots and lots of countries. The exact pace of decline varies a bit. Some of the biggest declines are in Latin America, East Asia, and actually some of the Scandinavian countries. And it matters quite a bit for a lot of reasons. One of them is the obvious, right? The next generation. Civilization is always one generation away from ending. And that sounds like apocalyptic, but it's actually just a very straightforward factual statement. We depend on the next generation. So that's true for something like Social Security. It's also true for something like, just having kids to take care of you as you get older. It's also going to be true just for the economy at large, right? You depend on younger workers, younger consumers to drive the economic returns for your 401k or whatever. So that's kind of one obvious reason that low fertility is bad. It's just it has like bad economic consequences. But another reason, which to me, I'll be honest, this is to me actually the most important reason that falling fertility is quite bad. You can imagine a scenario where, fertility has fallen to one child per woman, but that's because people just don't want kids anymore, right? Where everybody's like, I only want one kid. I'm only having one. And like people are just like making a rational decision to have cultural decline. Like you can imagine that scenario. And like, that's not my values, but if some society had those values, like, I guess like they have a right to that, I guess. um, uh, but that's not what's happening globally. Like in Korea, the average fertility rate is like 0.7, 0.6 to zero point 0.8 children per woman. But the average
Oh my
Korean woman says
God.
she wants 2.2. Okay.
Oh,
So like,
wow.
so
Even
this
in
is
Korea.
not, yeah, even in Korea, like this is not a product of like people don't want kids anymore. The average American woman wants like 2.4 kids, 2.5 kids, depends on exactly how you ask the question, and is going to have like 1.6. The average, there are some countries that genuinely have low preferences, like China. Hong Kong, Taiwan are probably around like 1.4 to 1.8 desired, but they are all at or below one actual. Malta and Austria have pretty low fertility desires, but most countries are actually above two, um, which tells you. And I should say there are countries where people have more kids than they desire. So there are some countries in like Africa, some in Asia, some of the lower income countries where people are still having a lot more kids than they want. Um, uh, but what I'm saying here is it's not that people are just sort of like choosing decline and like embracing civilizational degrowth. Okay. People want kids and they're failing to have them. They are experiencing roadblocks, obstacles, hiccups in their life. And we actually know these have bad consequences. Like we can look at a bunch of different studies. I won't, if you want more weeds on it, I can get into it later. But basically, we know that having missing children leads to much worse levels of like happiness and subjective well being later in life. So when you want
I
kids and
I
don't
actually
have
want you
them,
to get into the weeds on this because I
okay,
think this will be no, but like okay, so how do we know this and
yeah,
how does that manifest itself concretely?
yeah. So the best, like, really good causal instrument for this is a very niche case, but because it's niche, it makes it really clear what's happening. Is with IVF. So everybody who goes in to get IVF wants kids. Nobody's like, I don't want kids. Here's $40,000 to try and put children in me. So everybody going for IVF wants kids. Okay. And some countries have super crappy privacy laws that basically just let researchers have all of your personal information. So, like Denmark, Sweden, these countries, which is like a blessing for the
Gi
world and really
give
awkward
me
if
your private
you're,
information, it's okay, it's for science.
yeah. So if you're like Swedish tax ID number 3,825, there's like 50 papers all about your personal life, right? Okay, so the point is, we can merge the complete list of every medicine someone's ever been prescribed to other kinds of records. Okay, so for example, we can say, oh, they were prescribed all these like IVF procedures, and we can see were they prescribed antidepressants or not. Okay, so we can say, oh, and then we can also match that to birth records. We can say, oh, these people then showed up as a mother a year later, 9 months later, 18 months later. And what we can do is we can say, let's compare women of the same age, the same income, all these different background traits who all went in for IVF around the same time. And some of them, by chance, had a success. They got pregnant immediately. Others got pregnant, but it was 2 or 3 years later after several rounds, and others never got pregnant. So some of these women, by chance, had an IVF success, and others by chance had a failure. And then let's say how many antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti anxiety medications were they prescribed over the next 5 to 10 years? And the answer is if you have IVF failure, you have way higher rates of having antidepressants and anti anxiety medications prescribed to you. Okay. Um, so that's evidence one is just like failure to conceive very obviously leads to higher rates of what looks like clinically recognizable mood and behavioral disorders. Okay. Um, so that is like pretty rock solid evidence.
Right.
Um, and
It's a
that
natural
shows,
experiment.
yeah. Now, another way we can look at this is we can, in longitudinal data, we can say, okay, there's all these studies saying like what happens to happiness when you have a kid. And the general finding is there's like a short-term positive bump and then like not a lot of like long run change. But the problem is these studies fuse wanted and unwanted children. Okay? So like in the US, like 40% of births are unintended. Now that's not the same as unwanted, I want to
Oh,
acknowledge,
wow.
but there is like some, and this is similar. Like in France, it's going to be like 25 or 30% or something. Um, uh, so there's a lot of unintended, unwanted, whatever
Right.
conceptions and births.
So unintended. So what's I mean, the difference between unintended and unwanted. So you're a married couple, and it's like, oops, pregnant.
Yeah.
That's
But then you
unintended, but
don't
that's
say,
not
oh, I didn't want
unwanted.
that
Like you
kid.
happy,
Yeah.
right? You didn't
Yeah.
intend to get pregnant, but once you find out you're pregnant, you're happy.
Yeah. So in general, unintended pregnancies are way more likely to also be unwanted. but not always the case. Um, and intended pregnancies are way more likely to be wanted. But regardless, the data we often have is actually on intentions, not wantedness. Um, but we can say, okay, in longitudinal data sets like the British Household Panel Survey or the survey of, there's a German one abbreviated SOEP. I forget what it stands for. It's probably like 4 German words that are actually a whole paragraph. And what we can say is, okay, in these surveys, when you have a kid, there's like a short-term bounce in happiness and then it sort of levels out. But if you segregate that by intended births and unintended, for intended births, you see a big increase in happiness in the short run. And then it does decrease a bit, but it remains a significant increase like forever. Okay. For unintended births, you see a big decline in happiness and then a gradual, basically an increase in statistical noise over time. Some people kind of make their peace with their unintended birth and ultimately become rather happy. Other people don't. So what this tells us is having intended children creates happiness. Okay. And
Right.
having unintended children creates sadness. And what does that tell us? Having things consistent with your desires tends to make, like, if somebody says, I want a banana, and you tell them no bananas for you, like, it doesn't matter if bananas are objectively associated with happiness. People who want bananas are probably going to be happier when they get bananas and unhappy when you tell them no bananas. Okay. Um, the final way we can do this is we can look at, again, a longitudinal survey in the US, National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, where we have data on people's overall number of desired children, actual fertility, happiness, and well being across decades of their life course. So I can say, when you told me at age 16 how many kids you wanted, at age 40 or whatever, did you end up above or below that? And then if I compare where you are in the distribution of happiness when you were young to where you are in the distribution of happiness when you're old, what we see is the happiest people in the NLSY are the people who had more children than they desired. And we'll come to why that is
Oh,
in a second.
interesting.
And the most unhappy are those who had fewer than they desired. Now, this is not me saying,
Could they be
go have
childless
unwanted
cat ladies
kids.
by any chance?
What happened is people who had more children than they desired in their teenage years tended to be people, their life went better than they anticipated. They fell in love earlier, they got married earlier,
Ah.
they shifted their desires upwards over the course of their life. Whereas people who ended up with fewer children than they intended tended to be cheap people that their life went badly. Maybe they had an episode of incarceration. Maybe they have an episode where they fall out of the survey for a few waves because we couldn't find them because they were strung out on drugs somewhere. Maybe they had employment interruptions or they never got married, these types of things. So you can say, well, the real cause was those bad things that happened in life. And like, I agree. But I think it tells you something when life goes well, people raise their desires. And when life goes badly, people undershoot their desires. Um, so all this is evidence that basically
Hang on,
societies
hang
of
on. Can you
yeah.
can you repeat that? When life goes badly, people undershoot their desires, and when life goes well, people overshoot their desires. What does that
When
mean?
life goes well, people raise their desires. They don't overshoot them per se. So they overshoot. Sorry, it's a bit complicated math. They overshoot their desires at time 1, but then at time 2 they raise their desires. They say, "Well, life is going well. Now I don't want 2, I want 3." Okay? But when
Ah,
life
I
is going
see.
badly, people actually don't tend to cut their desires as much. They do it some. There's a little bit of kind of rationalization downwards, but not as much. Rather, when life goes badly, people still say, I would have loved to have 2 or 3 or
Right.
whatever, but they just don't achieve it. Okay. So that's
Got it. Got
basically
it. Got
what
it.
we
Got it.
observe
Got
in
it.
reality.
I
So
got it.
all this to me
I
says,
thought you were making a deep philosophical point about how, but no, it's just like
well,
relative
I
to
will
how
say
many children people want.
one of the best predictors of increasing the number of children you desire over the course of your life is having children. So as people experience having
That's
children, they tend
fascinating.
to
So,
want
right,
more.
the more you have kids, the more you want kids.
Yeah. Because
Yes,
guess what? Kids, I mean, literally right now, I can
definitely true for
hear
me.
my 14-year-old screaming as she goes down for nap through the wall. And yet I would still tell you kids are great and they're more fun than you expect. Like the narrative you hear in society is like, oh, there's so much work, like you never sleep. And yes, it's true. You realize that 5 hours of sleep is fine. At the same time, they're like so much
Also, it
more
doesn't
fun and
last. It
satisfying.
doesn't last that long. That period.
No, eventually you reach a period where they're all teenagers and they sleep for like 18 hours a day. So,
Yes, that's also
so
true. But before that, you reach a period where you can just say, "Go to your room." Um, that was the
yes,
line in my
stop
house.
bothering me.
Yes, exactly. It's like the line in my house was, "Go to sleep doesn't mean sleep. It means go into your room, close the door, and don't make a noise. What goes
Yes.
on in there is none of my business, but stay in there and don't make a noise."
Yes, exactly. It's the don't ask, don't tell of parenting.
Exactly. All right. So we got sidetracked, but this is fascinating about like how people get unhappy when they don't have the amount of kids they want, and how people get happier
Yeah.
when they do.
So the
Uh,
upshot of this is a society of falling fertility is a society of greater personal misery.
yes.
This is a society of more people who are just really disappointed with their life and probably kind of angry at how things went for them.
Yep.
And the upshot is it's also a society less invested in the next generation,
Yep.
right? That like you've got all these old people looking at the next generation and being like, none of those are my people. Um,
Right.
so this is just a recipe for a lot of social dysfunction, frankly.
Indeed.
It's a recipe for a lot of misery and social dysfunction. It's going to be an unpleasant outcome as we get to that period. But I want to emphasize the kind of dysfunction. The economic stuff is a collective action problem. If you're like, oh, you know, if people don't have babies, the economy will be bad, so I should have babies. You can't control your neighbor. Maybe you'll have babies and nobody else will, and now your children are just going to experience a worse economic environment. Okay. Like you can't fix that. But the disappointment side, you can fix. Like it's up
Right.
to you. Only you can prevent fertility disappointment. Okay? Like
To some
this is a
extent,
thing that
anyway.
like it doesn't depend on your neighbor to also get on board
Right.
with pronatalism to fix the problem of like disappointment. All it depends on is basically like somebody who also wants to like mix their genes with you. Like that's pretty much the criteria.
Yeah. So, another point about the how bad it is that I want you to just touch on is compounding, because this is something that people
Yes.
don't really realize, is that this stuff compounds. And so they imagine, oh, people have fewer babies. Okay, maybe it causes some fiscal problems. Maybe some people are less happy than they would otherwise be because they don't have their desired
But we'll get through
fertility.
the hump and it'll be okay.
Exactly. Exactly. So why isn't there a hump? Why is there a cliff instead?
So imagine. So let's simplify and say that the replacement rate is 2. It's technically anywhere from 2 to 4, depending on local mortality rates, but we conventionalize as 2.1. But for simple math, let's say it's 2. Imagine a society where everybody has 2 children. Over time, that society, and let's assume that there's no migration on net, but let's assume that life expectancy is rising, basically like our real world, where we're getting better at like curing diseases. Over time, population will grow even though fertility is just 2, because yes, each couple of 2 people is having 2 kids. But because life expectancy is rising and people are living longer, each generation stays in the population pyramid for longer. Okay, great. That's like a fine scenario. Um, Imagine the same scenario, but everybody has like 1.9 kids. Okay. It's plausible that population will still be stable or grow in the long run because life expectancy is rising. Okay, so like, yes, each generation is a bit smaller, but each generation lives a bit longer, so they stay in the population pyramid longer. So population is going to be stable. Like demand for houses will be roughly stable. Demand for hot dogs will be roughly. Sorry, you're French. I should use like some French analogy. Demand for
Demand for
baguettes will be
croissant,
relatively stable. Yeah. And But you'll get like this
demand for
older
delicious
society.
espresso.
There you go. You'll get this is an aging society scenario. Okay. So you'll get challenges with like dependency ratios, but like fundamentally, you don't get like a collapse of social scale. And so this is a problem that demographers have been writing about for decades and decades and decades. It was always assumed to be the basic problem that like fertility will even out close to replacement, but we'll have aging. So like there's all this writing about like what to do about an aging society. But now imagine a different scenario where fertility is 1.5 per generation. Well, in this case, each generation is 25% smaller than the one before. And yeah, they might live a little bit longer. And so they like stay in the cohort longer, but they're not living 25% longer. Okay. At this point in society, you should not expect that each generation will live 25% longer. Okay. Um, so that means in the long run, the actual scale of society declines. Now, in that first generation, it's 25% smaller. Okay. And the second generation is 25% smaller than that. But that means the third generation, but that means that third generation is actually 0.75 squared the size of the first generation. Okay. So what's 0.75 squared? It's something like 0.6, 0.68, 0.67 or something.
Yeah,
So it's
I'm
like a
saying that.
third, it's like a bit more than a third smaller. And then each generation is subsequently smaller. And the result is that you actually get an escalating pace of decline. That at first it's a slow dribble. You're kind of, you stabilize and then you go down. And the pace at which your society descales gets faster and faster. This is obviously a problem because once that decline starts, you get constant economic headwinds. And those economic headwinds create bad life outcomes for people. And what did we already say happens with bad life outcomes? People fall further below their desired fertility. Okay. So you get kind of a vicious
Oh.
cycle where it becomes very difficult to stop the train. Actually a train going off a cliff is kind of a great metaphor, right? When the first car goes off the cliff of the train, you can like get a big enough train to pull it back the other way. But like at some point enough cars have gone off the end that like there's no train big enough to do it.
And it just slides off because it pulls down the
It
rest.
just pulls itself down. Now, so that was 1.5. Now envision a society where each generation only has one kid. Okay, half of each generation
Right.
is 50% smaller. Okay, remember Korea is at like 0.7 right now. So is like I think Hong Kong is like 0.7, 0.8. Taiwan's at like 0.8, 0.9. I think Macau is at like 0.6. China generally is probably around 1. Japan's like I think like 1.1 or 1.2. Italy and Spain are like 1.1, 1.2 or something like that. A lot of the Eastern Europeans are close to that. We are looking at a lot of societies where their population, each generation will be 50% smaller than the one before it. And by the way, this doesn't just impact those countries. Let's say that you are one of the wealthier countries of Western Europe, okay? And like France or Germany or the UK, or do we count the UK as a wealthier country of Western Europe? Okay. So you're Norway. Let's say you're Norway. Okay. You've been riding on immigration for a while, right? Like you've been saying, okay, we don't have that many kids, but um, immigrants will fill the gap. But the countries the immigrants are coming from are having smaller and smaller generations.
Right.
Okay. So if you've been having Polish workers fill your labor supply gap, there's not that many generations of Polish workers left. Okay. Their
Right.
fertility is 1.
Right. This
1.3 or
is
something.
yeah. I wanted to get into this point because like when you talk about declining fertility, people will say, "Oh, immigration," but fertility is declining everywhere. So that's not an option either.
The example I love to give,
Even
so I
putting
do a lot of
aside
research.
questions about like cultural blah 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 or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever the
So
downsides of immigration you believe exist or don't believe exist, the math
yeah.
simply doesn't work anymore.
Well, and the example I love to give, and this isn't just francophone pandering, is that Nepal and France have the same fertility rate. And I give this example because I've done a lot of work on France, and then I just 2 weeks ago I was doing field work in Nepal for a research project. I do a lot of work in Nepal, and these are very different countries. Um, France has like 25 times the GDP per capita of Nepal or something. Even at like PPP per capita, it's like 10 times or something. Um, uh, but they have the same fertility rate.
Oh wow.
So and Nepal is famous as a country that like sends tons of laborers abroad. Like Nepalese people, like I forget if it's like like 20% or something of Nepalese men will like
Wow.
spend at least a year abroad in the Gulf countries or East Asia or India
Oh, I
working
see.
and
Yeah.
sending remittances home. Like this is a country that is like a huge manpower source for the world. Um, and now their fertility is below replacement. Like, how much longer is that going to be there? Not much longer. Um, so this is not just like a rich country thing. Go to Bangladesh; it's even lower. You can go to urban Africa, like Maputo, I believe, which is the biggest city in Mozambique, had a recent demographic and health survey that showed a fertility rate of like 1.9.
Oh,
The GDP per
interesting.
capita in Maputo is like $900.
Right, right, right. Oh, interesting. So urban Africa is also, um,
Falling.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, all of Africa's falling.
Because I also wanted you to touch on Africa briefly, which is the point you made at that conference. I remember. So one of the things because like when you talk about this, people say, "Oh, Africa," and it's like, yes. One of the things that I did know is that it keeps trending down, but one of the things you pointed out is that it's already very low relative to their GDP compared to
Yes.
historical data.
If you compare African fertility to African GDP, and then you compare it to like Western Europe's history, like what was Western European fertility when we had the GDP per capita of Africa? Okay. We had way higher fertility when we had
Right.
their GDP per capita. Okay. Um, the countries that had similar GDP per capita, and like Latin America also had much higher fertility when they were at similar GDP per capita. Um, the countries that were similar when they were at a similar GDP per capita are like Korea, Hong Kong,
Right.
Japan, Taiwan, these places, Bangladesh, India. Um, so my view, or like Thailand or something, my view is that Africa is it's taking its time because um,
It's
they keep having, you know, disasters and wars and bad governance and all this
right.
stuff. And we can talk about why that would relate to fertility. You know, we can get into that. But suffice to say, African high fertility is not because like Africans have like special baby juju or something. Like it's basically just that the cultural narratives that drive low fertility are most persuasive in environments where economic development seems like a personal aspirational
Right.
possibility.
Right.
And in much of Africa, that is not yet true.
Right.
Um, and
And if they had
so
baby juju, we could, steal it like we stole everything else.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's
Sorry, I'm being
basically what we
French for a
do, right?
second.
Like the Western countries, what's that?
I said I was just being French talking about stealing natural resources from
Yes, but
Africa,
this is
which isn't true, by the way.
this is kind of what happens anyway, though, right? Is that like the Western countries don't have enough babies to sustain themselves, and they say,
Right.
well, let's bring in like a bunch of Africans to prop up our society, and nobody says like, well, when African fertility falls, who will prop them up?
Yep. Yep.
Like, and the answer is no one.
Yep.
No one will. And it's going to be really, really bad. I mean, if you're Thailand right now and your GDP per capita is very low and your fertility is, I don't know, 1.1 or something, like you're very much thinking
Right.
like, what is the future here?
Right.
Like
Right. So even Africa is not gonna save us. They're on the same track as us, just on a time delay.
yes. And the really terrifying question is who will save Africa?
Yeah. Yeah. No
Or
one.
more pressingly, who will save India? Because they're below
Right.
replacement right now.
Right. Okay, so we sort of covered how bad. I take extensive notes on this, and so I first wrote how bad, and then I wrote why bad. So we covered some of the why bad. We covered the sort of economic aspect of it, which I think is, the most obvious because the math, especially if you've got aging population, is just brutal. We covered the happiness aspect. There's another aspect, um, which is harder to sort of explain, but that I think is deeply important, is a sort of cultural aspect to what, a country where the majority, or if not the majority, the critical mass of people are old people, is not a dynamic country. It's a country where the majority of the market spending is old people, is not a country where you're going to have a lot of
Yeah.
luck with some innovative, weird new product in the market that might actually succeed in a country full of 22-year-olds who can take a chance in some new unproven gizmo. It's going to be a country where the politics are risk averse, and so on and so forth. Um, do you you know do you have studies that
Yeah.
measure this?
We do. A number of years ago, I wrote a paper on this, summarizing a lot of them. That basically, um, younger societies produce more entrepreneurs, they produce more patents, they produce higher value patents, they produce more businesses that grow to become employers. Um, they adopt new products more quickly, they scale new
Right.
products more quickly. Um, to a considerable extent, the pace of innovation in a country is a simple equation of basically like raw number of 25-year-olds times nutrition quality when they were 5 years old times like tax rate on capital investment. Like this is just basically innovation. Okay. So, and the reason for this is like, I'm not like a world class intelligence person. Like, I'm just not. Like, I sometimes have met these people that just have these like blistering intellects, and it's just like immediately outclassed. Okay. So, like, I might do a little bit of innovation in my life where I like write a fairly interesting paper that 8 other sociologists are like, oh, cool, we'll cite this a few times. Okay. Like, that's my innovation. But then you get like the Elon Musks of the world who are like, well, my rocket engineer isn't quite working on my pace. I'm just going to step in and do it myself and like invent new rockets that reduce the cost. Okay, like those people occur as an approximately stable ratio of like share of births. Okay, it's just like
Right.
once in a generation talents are more common when the generation is twice as big. Okay,
Right.
um, and so assuming that those people like basically don't experience nutritional stunting in childhood, so like their brain can develop normally, and assuming they live in a society that is like not punitive on like entrepreneurship, risk taking, stuff like that, which, whatever, call it capital tax rate or call it,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
whatever, your legal environment for entrepreneurship, basically. Um, they will just like kind of as a just like law of nature, they will produce some patents. Okay. They will produce things, and a lot of them will suck, but like one of them will revolutionize society. Okay. So this is just there's actually a great study of World War I mortality in France that shows that like municipalities of France that had more casualties in World War I had like a proportional decrease, particularly like officer casualties, had a proportional decrease in patenting after the war. But then the places that had like the most lopsided ratio of like enlisted man casualties versus officer then had a shift in innovation composition towards labor replacing things, because suddenly like labor was way more expensive because there just like weren't that many workers. And they're like, crap, we have to automate away labor. And so then it's a funny paper. It's this interesting kind of shift in entrepreneurship. But whatever the case, uh, um, it is the case that when you have more minds in societies that can feed them, educate them, and create a market for them, you get more innovation. And so people are like, what caused the Industrial Revolution? Potatoes. Like potatoes. Like this is very obvious. Okay, like the level of science that Europe was at in like 1492, other societies had gotten there. Okay. Like that, the big takeoff in like the huge, like path breaking takeoff in like European welfare and well being and population growth and everything is in like the 1600s. Okay. And then into the
Right.
1700s. The big takeoff in innovation is in the early 1700s. And like it was potatoes. It was that potatoes and other new world crops enabled population to rise to reach a scale where like more ideas could percolate and be tested. Feudal institutions couldn't keep up with controlling people. The return to capital rises. Like there's all this stuff, but it's
Right.
basically potatoes.
What one thing people aren't aware of or don't have as part of their mental furniture is just how big Europe's population was in the 19th century relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah. It's just, I'm not even like
It
by
was
like
just
the late
bigger.
1700s, you're seeing this just like Europe is just way out of its historic proportion. Um, Particularly France, is just this like
This, I
behemoth
mean, this has
investment
been
board.
a hot take of mine for a very long time, which is, the Industrial Revolution was caused by the population boom. So
Yes. Well, and
I'm
the
glad
interesting thing
I'm glad
is the
somebody
two
agrees with
different
me.
paths, right? So like France gets all this population growth and it kind of like sits in France. And it doesn't generate an industrial revolution, but it does generate other kinds of revolutions. In particular, it generates a revolution in secularization in the advent of modern fertility decline in the
Right,
early to mid
right,
1700s.
right.
Um, Britain has
Can
the
you please
same.
explain that? Because I know the study you're referencing, but
I will. Let me get like
okay,
the British
okay,
counterfactual first. Britain and Spain and Portugal have a different solution, which is basically they just kick everyone across the ocean. Um, and they get a very different outcome. And arguably it's a more efficient outcome, actually. And so you can argue about like why did
yeah, but the problem is
industrialization
French
kick
people
off in
didn't want
Britain?
to live because France is so nice. Like, no, like,
Exactly.
in the 17th and 18th century, France was already a technocracy, so you had all these
Yeah.
incentives programs trying to pay people to move to America, and they wouldn't
Yep.
do it.
And they wouldn't do it. Yeah. Also, the French colonies like kind
Whereas,
of sucked more.
if
And like I
if
say
you
that
live
is
in
I
England,
live.
yes, you're gonna wanna leave.
But also, like, I mean, I lived in Quebec for 4 years, so I can say this. Like, if your option is moving to Pennsylvania or Quebec, like, everyone will choose Pennsylvania. Like,
Fair enough.
literally 100% of people. So, okay, yeah. So, the question of French fertility. So, this is actually hugely important to understand France versus England on this. People have a mental model that is wrong, and it's this like, rising incomes, industrialization, urbanization caused falling fertility because once you have money, why would you have babies? Okay, like people have this model. It's a
Yes.
folk version of what's called in the literature the modernization hypothesis. Among
Yes.
demographers, the
I was
modernization.
taught this in school, by the way. I was
Yes,
taught this in
yes.
middle school.
So if you go on the AP geography test in the US, there will be a question about the modernization hypothesis. They will say it's true. And the reason they will say it's true is because a group called Population Connection has basically captured the AP review board for all of the demography related topics. And they have an over, like you can look on their website, they brag about like, we run the AP grading stuff for demography things. We run like, we train 10,000 teachers a year. And their whole thing is to try and convince children to not want to have kids. Okay, like that's their
That's
mission
wonderful.
statement. You can go look it up. Population Connection. It's out there. The Twitter account More Births has a nice little short essay on this where he puts together the numbers. Um, I don't know. I actually don't think that this group has been very successful at persuading kids not to have babies. We could talk about why, but they're trying. But if you actually talk to working demographers, like people in the field publishing, no one believes this theory. Okay, it's wrong. Like it's widely understood to have been very strongly falsified, like decades ago, and continuing so today.
Interesting. Oh,
So
interesting.
the prediction of the modernization hypothesis is once incomes begin to rise, mortality will begin to fall. And after mortality begins to fall, particularly child mortality, fertility will begin to fall as people no longer like need to have as many kids to hit their goals. Okay, this is the theory. Here's what we actually know. Fertility decline has happened many times in human history. You can see it in Edo period Japan. You can see it in classical Rome. You can see it in Puritan Massachusetts. You can see it most famously in 18th century France. And I say famously also because it's been very well studied by an economist named Guillaume Blanc. Um, and he finds that basically uh, the map of that French fertility starts to fall in like the 1720s, 1730s. Um, and it doesn't fall evenly. It falls in places that were that had early exposure to what we call secularizing influences. He points to a number of these. One is the Jansenist controversy. There was kind of this movement that could be criticized by people hostile to it as crypto Protestant. Persons favorable to it would say it was a reformist movement within Catholicism. But regardless of the case, it threatened the general authority of the traditional clerical class. Um, Around the same time, we start to see priests specifically condemning pulling out as a method of control.
There was a joke about this in France in the 19th century. The joke was that the French were the smartest people in the world because they'd invented pulling out.
Yeah. So you get this stuff, and then also you can look at like during the French Revolution, the share of priests who like said, "Ah, screw it, I'll take the like secular vow to the nation or whatever," is like a
Right,
strong proxy for the places that already had fertility decline.
right.
Um, Blanc has a new paper that isn't published yet, but I've seen a like a presentation version of it where they modulate these results a bit and they show that like it's kind of actually a little bit of an interaction between like exposure to secularization and certain local economic factors. There's also an argument that like different inheritance rules played a part, but the factor under all of it is basically secularization.
Yeah.
Okay, there's other modulating factors, inheritance, subsistence limits. Okay, which parts of France are good for potatoes and which aren't. Okay, but fun that's not a joke actually. Like different
Oh,
like crop
I bet.
regions of France. Okay, um,
Okay,
but
I'm
fundamentally it's secularization, and
yeah.
then this explains fertility falling, and then other parts of Europe begin to have fertility transition in the early 1800s to the extent that they are exposed to the French language. Now, this matters because yes, the poison of the French language. This matters because basically some languages are more
French is
similar to
such a
French.
beautiful language that you will lose. You
Exactly. I
know,
was going to
you'll
say
stop
some
eating. You'll
languages,
lose
yeah.
interest in sex. You will just
So some
spend all your
languages
days
are
reading French
more
poetry.
beautiful than others. That is to say, they are more similar to French than others. And the more similar your local language was to French, the earlier your fertility began to decline.
Oh my god!
Um, Now, interestingly, a language that was fairly similar to French, where fertility decline didn't happen. Well, you could debate similarity to French, but like phylogen, like, like in terms of like the family tree of languages,
Yeah,
is like technically similar to French. Is English. Um,
yeah.
and
English is
the
just bad French.
I would say French is just English without the blessing of the egalitarian Nordic tradition.
Yeah.
So, but whatever the case, English is a holdout language. Okay, they're like, screw it, we're not declining. Babies rock, make the babies. And so there's no decline in Great Britain in the early 1800s. There's no fertility decline, and this is interesting because if your theory is the modernization hypothesis,
Right.
Britain is the place where you
Right.
get big income
Right.
increases. And France is not. So the map of early fertility transition is the map of basically cultural exposure to Paris. Okay, the map of and not industrialization. So like the Netherlands is also like an early industrializer and is
Oh my
not
god! I
like the early
apologize to the
fertility decline.
world. I
Yeah,
apologize. If you
you
compound,
all
it's like
literally
how
have the
many
decline of
billions of
humanity.
lives have we prevented? Oh,
So, but it's not just you. I'm getting as an
so
American.
basically the solution is to go back in time and kill baby Rousseau,
So as an
who
no,
was a Protestant, by
no,
the
it's
way.
before Rousseau. It's before Rousseau.
It
Like the
is, it is,
decline
it
starts.
is, it
So,
is, it is.
but we have to get to England. You know, as an American, I have to crap on all Europeans. So we're coming to England. Um, so the Brits are a holdout for a while, and they actually have censorship laws. Like it is illegal to publish manuals that teach women how to do birth control. Okay.
Good.
And what's interesting is it was also illegal in America, but in the 1830s, a Massachusetts doctor wrote one anyway. And he published this thing. He gets arrested for it, put in jail. The book
Of
is
course, it was
suppressed.
Massachusetts.
Yeah, which their fertility transition was also in the 1700s and also because of secularization, but a different kind of secularization. Okay. So, like, in the same way that Paris is like the patient zero of fertility transition in Europe, um, Boston is patient zero in the United States. So, like, the more exposure you have to Boston, like, if Boston newspapers come to you, like,
It's like
you
the
are,
two hell mouths on the
yes,
planet,
yes,
like where all of
the great,
all of the
yeah,
bad
yeah, yeah.
ideas come out
Yeah,
and
like
sort
the
of
Cthulhu consuming human fertility. They are just
ah,
gaping maws in
both very pretty cities architecturally.
wonderful places.
Um,
Yeah. So whatever the case, in Britain they have all these laws banning the spread of these ideas, but this Massachusetts book is printed by two secularists in Britain who they're fishing for a court challenge. They think they can beat the censorship laws. And so they
Ah,
publish the book. They immediately get arrested. There's a censorship case. But here's two really important facts. First, the book was full of crap. Okay. None of the advice it gave was actually correct. It was like, you could use this chemical after you have sex. The chemical doesn't work. Okay.
right.
Like, so it had no actual scientifically correct information about how to do birth control. Okay. Secondly, the court case was covered in tons of newspapers all over the world, but only English speaking newspapers and not all newspapers. Okay, so there's authors of this study studying this called the Bradlaugh-Besant case in 1876 to 77, and they show that around the world, wherever the local newspapers cover the case, fertility declines, starting in 1878 or 1877.
So it's
Okay,
like the MTV reality
yeah,
TV
it's like the
thing.
16 and pregnant thing.
Yeah,
But the
yeah,
interesting thing is, again, it's not shaped by whether they cover the news, by like which side the newspaper takes in the case. And again,
right,
there's no actual scientific knowledge spreading here. Okay.
right,
All that's going on is the breaking of a taboo. Now
right,
you can talk about family limitation.
right,
And that's what they were calling it then, family limitation.
right.
So starting in 1877, the entire Anglophone world just off a cliff. And then that does
Incredible.
spread everywhere because um, English is, in fact, the global language, and it has been for quite a long time. And so the French effect is kind of slow moving. It takes a little while to percolate, but when the Anglophone world pivots very quickly, the whole world is pivoting. By 1900, the entire Western world and really the entire industrializing world, so including Japan, is starting to pivot at this point.
Fascinating. Okay.
Um,
Uh, I I'm gonna cut you off here because we've got
yep, you need to
45
cut me
minutes,
off.
and there's a really important topic that I want to discuss afterwards. So, when you talk to people about this stuff, you talk about how that's really bad, blah 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 blah, and they sort of nod along, but then they say very confidently, "Well, there's nothing you can do about it. Everything that's been tried to boost birth rates everywhere has failed." They say this very confidently, as if it's an established fact. Um, do you agree?
No, that's full of crap. So,
Okay, go on.
fertility has fallen many times in human history, and it keeps bouncing back. So, the Roman decline was largely driven by infanticide. Christians promoted anti-infanticidal norms. Fertility rose. The Japanese decline was largely driven by infanticide. The Meiji government promoted anti-infanticidal norms. Fertility rose. Modern declines are not driven by infanticide. They are related to abortion, but as the US has discovered, even when you ban abortion, fertility doesn't really rise much. They are driven by these other norms. Norms that I'm not going to belabor what they actually are too much, but basically, I'm going to call them developmental idealism. Basically, they are the idea that um, suppressing fertility is a path to prosperity and happiness. This is not true, but it is a wide belief around the world. So these norms spread and fertility fell. Now, a lot of countries have attempted to push back on this, and they are almost always successful. And what I mean by that is when a country gives a $2,000 baby bonus, okay, that is to say, when a country goes to parents and gives them a few crumbs, okay, those parents produce slightly more mouths to eat the crumbs, okay. So when you do trivially small programs to support families, like giving families $5,000, you do in fact get trivially small increases in fertility, okay. Um, when you do big programs to boost fertility, like a lot of Soviet countries did when they put in draconian childlessness taxes, like Israel does with a whole range of programs, um, you do get bigger fertility increases. No country has used fiscal policy to increase fertility by more than 0.3 children per woman, but some have used cultural interventions. So, for example, the country of Georgia has a state church. The state church I'm not going to
Right.
belabor this too
This is a
much, but
famous
basically,
one.
they did a reform that altered the status of having a third child. And fertility rose from 1.6 to 2.2 in about 12 months, 18 months. And it remained above replacement for about 10 or 12 years, basically until COVID. And it remains much higher than other countries nearby. Um, Armenia now has higher fertility than Azerbaijan, which in the long run is going to cause some interesting. It's been a bad few years of strategy for the Armenians, but in 20 years, things may tip the other way because the Azeris are not having very many kids, and the Armenians have thrown a lot of money, like a whole lot of money, at having kids, and their fertility has risen. Um, I could
Okay,
go on and on,
so
but
devil's advocate, why are places like Hungary still having their fertility crash even though they
so
spend like 4% of
yeah.
GDP, which is a huge amount, actually.
So it's really not that much. You know, Hungary's not the
Well,
biggest spender.
realistically, it's a big amount.
So they're not the biggest spender in the OECD, I'll say. In fact, I don't know if
On
they're
on
top
on
five
pro-family policy? I mean, they say
on
they are.
on on no on fertility and child supports. No, they're not. Um, there's also a question on their numbers. I'll just say the last time the OECD did an apples to apples comparison, Hungary was at 2%. I'm not 100% sure how they get to 4 or 5%. They may be doing a little creative accounting with their debt programs. A lot of their programs are basically debt forgiveness. It's
Okay.
possible that they may be counting future loan forgivenesses that they are
Oh.
anticipating doing as part of their
Okay,
spending. I'm not
so,
100% sure. But whatever
uh,
the case, Hungarian fertility has risen quite dramatically. They've had the most positive change in fertility of any country in Europe. Actually, sorry, the second most. Czechia is beating them because Czechia is one of the only countries that has spent even more has increased their funding even more over the last 15 years.
okay, so
Um,
let's get down to brass tacks. Policy, what works, what doesn't, which countries, when, how do we know that it's a causal impact?
Yeah.
Like,
So we have dozens of studies that look at programs where some families were eligible for them and others weren't due to, various quirks of policy design, random chance, whatever. And they reliably show that when you subsidize fertility, you get more kids. But here's the problem. So what I've said so far is it actually works. It is in fact the case. When you spend money on families, you get more babies. Now let's get to the con case. That's the pro case. And again, I can point you to literally dozens of studies showing this, literally dozens of real world cases of countries. We can talk more about France. I assume you'll want to talk some about that in a bit. But
I know France is like one of the leaders in this, but we
yeah, yeah,
don't
yeah,
have to
yeah.
talk specifically about France.
France has some of the most generous policies in the world, and it's no surprise that France has the highest fertility in Europe, and that it's entirely driven by native-born French women. Not high. I mean, yes, there's also immigrants that have high fertility, but native born French women have like zero point 0.3 or zero point 0.4 more kids than most other European countries. And this is due to policy. There's actually, you can just look at towns along the border in France, and like on the French side of the border, they have like 0.2, 0.3 more kids. Um, so, whatever the case, that's the pro case. The policy works. But then you say, then why is it that when you do these, why has nobody gotten back to 2.1? So
Yeah.
first of all, I would say some countries have. Okay, Georgia did, and they did it with a mixture of financial benefits and cultural interventions. A lot of Soviet countries, post-Soviet countries, particularly in Central Asia, actually did. Um, but the reason is kids are insanely expensive, and I don't just mean in money. There's a recent paper that showed that if you add up all the taxes and benefits parents get and compare them to all the transfers they make to society, such as by the time they spend raising their kids, parents are reimbursed for something like 15% of the gifts they give to society. Okay?
Okay, that's fascinating. Can you detail that? So
Yeah.
basically,
So
yeah. So the
basically,
amount of tax that a married couple with kids pays over their lifetime.
and all the benefits they give, the free education for their kids in the public system,
Right.
all this stuff.
Oh, okay.
Then you have to say, well, what's the cost of parenting? Well, one, when you have a kid, your income often falls because often one spouse takes time off work. Okay. So that's one cost. 2, you buy things for the kid. Duh. 3, you spend and this is the biggest cost. You spend a lot of time on your kids. And time is money. Okay? If you were to pay parents a tenth of the minimum wage, okay, for the time they spend rearing their kids, like immediately the wage, you'd be talking about like 20% of the economy or something, or like 15% of the economy, okay? 10%. It's I forget the exact share. It depends on each country, but it's a big share of the economy, okay? So then you have to ask, well, but why should you do that? Why would you do this? Well, because think about the benefits of parenting. Who gets the benefits? Mostly not the parent,
Right.
mostly the child and society at large. Don't get me wrong, parenting's fun. I like my kids. I love my kids. I do derive a lot of satisfaction for them. But the reality is, most of the good things I create for anyone in the world by raising my kid are good things that my child is the main beneficiary of, or maybe that their future spouse is the beneficiary of, or their coworkers, the people that benefit from the products they make. Regardless, it's mostly what's called an externality. It's basically a gift that I'm giving to society for which I am not compensated. When you realize that, you say, okay, so that gift basically is the cost. That's actually basically the cost of parenting. If I let my kid live with me until they're 28, their share of the house is part of the cost of parenting. Okay. The time I spend doing their laundry because they are immature and they refuse to do their own laundry is part of the cost of parenting. So then you look at a society like Korea, where kids live with their parents until they're 32, and then
Oh
parents buy
my.
them a house. Okay. And you realize the cost of parenting is insanely high. Okay. And demographers have been arguing for decades. It's actually called what's called the wealth transfer hypothesis, associated with demographer named Caldwell. That basically the thing driving low fertility on some level is a shift in the dynamics of wealth transfer. Once upon a time, children were an earning proposition for parents. Now they're not. And in fact, they keep becoming a bigger and bigger losing proposition for parents, okay? Because norms of intensive parenting mean you have to do all this stuff,
Right. That's a big
increasing like,
problem.
yeah, and also children remain children longer, right? Basically, if you live with your parents
Right.
and or you are still in school, sociologically speaking, you are a child. Okay?
Right.
Whatever the law says, if you are in the social position of the learner or the social position of like the economic dependent, you're a child. Okay? So, the
That's okay. I
cost of
haven't
raising
been a child since I was 38, so,
okay. Yeah, exactly. I say this as someone who has not finished his PhD. Okay. But the point is, I can expect that my kids are going to be dependent on me much longer than age 18. Okay.
Right.
To some extent. And so basically, the cost of raising children is monumentally vast in modern societies, and the benefits are not enormous. So when countries give these benefits, yeah, it helps and it offsets 0.25% of the cost of having kids, and so that
Okay.
increases fertility 0.25%. But what
Okay.
you need, and to be clear, I'm totally in favor of these policies, but what you need is also interventions that reduce the cost of having kids. So you need to make housing cheaper so that the young people get the crap out of the basement. You need to have things that help people get jobs earlier in life. So that means deal with occupational licensing, deal with credentialization, deal with seniority based hiring, all these perverse and discriminatory norms that basically attack family formation. Okay. We need to do things to reduce the cost of parenting, and that means accelerating adulthood. Okay, child labor laws are ruining this civilization. No, I'm kidding. That's a joke. Um,
Uh,
but like on some level, like it's not that I want children like
okay,
slaving away on
here's
the factory
another
line. Um,
old-time French, pronatalism policy, which is military service. Because it's a rite of passage into adulthood, and,
yeah, I will put the kibosh on that though. Korea, just like
all right,
counterexample,
yeah,
Korea.
Korea's not great in that
Yeah.
regard. Okay,
So
got it.
yeah, I wish we could say, look, we can just create these things, but in practice, it just becomes another milestone people have to hit. It just becomes another 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 roadblock.
Okay.
Um,
So let's try. This is a policy podcast. Let's say, you know, I'm an American politician. I take your point about deregulation and lowering all of that. Agree to that, but that's just sort of generic deregulation stuff. Let's say I want a pro-natalist agenda that's somewhat realistic in the American context. How do I get the most bang for my buck? What works best?
so I'll give a couple of these in different arenas. We'll start with basically statutory things that would require Congress to act in a fiscally meaningful way. So, first, marriage penalties. For people who get married, the biggest hiccup in life is marriage. For people who get married at a given age, there has been no fertility decline in the United States and in most other countries in the last 15 years. Okay. So, like, the failure of sexy times in romance is like threatening civilization. We need people to fall in love faster, better, stronger, okay, and get married. So we have to say, why is marriage falling? And research suggests a big part of it is marriage penalties. So, for example, the earned income tax credit. If two working class people, maybe one of them has a kid, if two working class people get married, they can face enormous marriage penalties. They can lose thousands of dollars in
Right,
benefits.
right.
We have to correct that. Every means tested program has big marriage penalties. We have to correct that. It does cost money. And it does require Congress
Yeah,
to
yeah.
actually sit down in the weeds and do some like implicit marginal tax rate, trapezoids and
Right,
things like
right,
that.
right.
But this is one of the things we're doing at the Pronatalism Initiative, this think tank I head, where we are trying to support this kind of work, provide the expertise to be able
Yeah,
to
and it's
tackle
great
marriage
work,
penalties.
by the way. And
Yeah,
I read it all and I cite it whenever I can.
thank you. I appreciate that. So that's one. Another is deal with policies that are facially discriminatory towards marriage. So, like the child independent care tax credit is a tax credit that is not the child tax credit. The child independent care tax credit
Right,
is a
right.
tax credit that I won't belabor the exact details, but it's literally written. It explicitly excludes families that have a stay at home parent, and it's written to exclude families that are low income. So, like, you could understand subsidizing childcare for low income people because you say, okay, maybe it's good to get a job. It's a pathway out of poverty. Maybe childcare is the hiccup. We're going to subsidize your childcare. But no, this one just excludes low income people. It's like a subsidy only. People over $100,000 in income receive like half of the total benefit
Holy
of
cow.
all spending on this program. So it should just be abolished. We should just get rid of it. And plow the money into a bigger child tax credit. Okay. So we should expand the child tax credit. Um, I'm also open to changing the things it's refundable against, make it refundable against Social Security taxes, or something like that. There's hesitancy on making it a full child allowance, like full refundability. I understand the hesitancy. There are other interests here besides just family policy. We don't want to discourage work, but we could at least expand refundability to other work related things. Um, Another thing I think is really important and valuable um, is thinking about our retirement programs. Families subsidize all of society. There is no Social Security trust fund that actually pays for retirement. It is just the next generation paying for the current generation of
Yep.
retirees. Parents are the sole source of the next generation. They're eating the cost. And yet, parents approach retirement poorer because they took time off work, and particularly mothers. I should say, particularly mothers. Like widows and divorcees are really the people who suffer from this.
By the
They
way, in
approach,
France, until recent reforms, time spent pregnant and in maternity leaves counted as
yes,
extra to your pension.
it still does, right?
No, they changed that.
What?
They changed
No,
that in Macron's pension
no.
reform
Okay,
because
this
that's
is this
bad.
is
That's
like
sexist.
this is literally like France is one
Yeah.
of the examples I would give of like, here's a way to do this that other
Well, now
countries
you
do
have a
that's
natural
good.
experiment. 60 years from now, we can prove that it's a very bad idea.
Well, no, we can prove that I mean, it's people respond to retirement related incentives relatively quickly, actually. Um,
I know one lady who basically like timed out her like 4 or 5 births to like maximize her
Yep.
like pension
I would
fund
imagine that
under the French
fertility of
system.
women 35 plus would be affected by that almost immediately. So, care credits. The US should have care credits like
Can you
France.
explain what
And
that is?
yeah, it's what you were just saying, that basically we
Oh, right.
compensate
Pension
people
credits. Yeah.
for time they spend out of work raising children. So, one way to do this is just to say any year in which you were a legitimate claimant of the child tax credit, you will have the higher of your market income or your most recent year of market, like your market income, the highest of 2 or 3 years back, adjusted for inflation. Or some other kind of credit. You will get the higher of your market income or $40,000 for Social Security, whatever. So basically, you find a way of compensating for this time. And this is basically just a justice question. It's insane that the people doing the work to make the system solvent, that is, parents, get
Yep.
zero, like literally get punished for it.
No,
So,
I
um,
completely agree, but like most people don't accept or think of it that way.
it's unfortunately so, but there are about a dozen European countries that do this. So, to varying degrees of generosity, France had one of the more generous systems, and apparently now it's been repealed because, and Macron's all like, "Oh, we need demographic rearmament. Here, let
Yeah.
me take away actually good family policy." Okay, yeah, and then he's shocked, like, "Oh, why is fertility falling under my watch?" Ooh, ooh, ooh. Okay,
He's a bad president and
yeah.
also a bad person.
There's been a couple studies of Macron era reforms that all show that they've reduced fertility. No one has done this one, but someone should. This is like, you could do like how close you are to
I
retirement as a
assume
proxy
somebody
for
is.
exposure. So regardless, yeah, that's bad. So those are like fiscal policies that like Congress could do, but they do cost money. Then you think about like other things. So the HHS has a program called Title 10, which the statutory language for it says basically this is to support family planning, and in parentheses it says like reproductive health, infertility services, natural family planning, youth prevention. It doesn't say contraception. But historically, 90% of the funds have been used to subsidize contraception, and the other 10% have been used for sexual treatment and prevention of sexually transmitted infections. Fine, whatever. That's a legitimate use of that funding. But the law actually says infertility services. Okay? What a conservative administration in the US could do if they were so inclined is they could use DHHS to order recipients of Title 10 grants to guarantee that they spend at least some share of their money, call it 10%. So just not a majority. We're not even talking about a majority, just a percentage on statutorily reasonable and authorized activities. That is things like fertility education, fertility awareness. And the reason this is worth doing, we actually have multiple randomized controlled trials showing, first of all, people have really low awareness of fertility. They just have really bad, they think that their fertility is stable until they're like
Yeah.
35 and then
Yep.
it falls.
Yep.
And I'm like,
Yep.
no, 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 no.
Yep. No, no,
Like,
no, 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 no,
as
no.
soon as you finish pubescent development, for women, your fertility begins declining, and for men, your sperm quality begins declining. Okay, so like just point blank, like
Well, speak for
once
yourself, Stone. Mine is fine.
on average, at the average. So and people
I've
think, oh,
never
that means
been
like
average
15,
at
16.
anything.
No, but like truly like full physical maturity, we're talking something like, 17 to 22, somewhere in that range, depending on the person. But after that, there begins to be an approximately linear decline. Modern reproductive technology can only add about 1 to 3 years of reproductive life. People are like, oh, now with IVF, you can wait forever. No, you can add 1 to 3 years of
And
reproductive
like
lifespan.
freezing embryos doesn't work.
Um, Egg freeze. I mean, these things, they do increase reproductive lifespan some, but first of all, they're uncomfortable. Like going in and being like, okay, if I want to guarantee having 3 kids through egg freezing and I want to extract when I'm 20, you're talking about free like 3 to 10 rounds of egg retrieval, which is not fun. Um, so just like aside from costs, like
Right.
that is not, and also only about 20% of people who freeze their eggs when they're young ever use them. People do it as an insurance policy, even though they're not supposed to. I could go on about this, but the point is, we have randomized controlled trials where you take two groups. One of them, you educate them about their fertility. The other one, you don't. if all you do is just give people scientifically correct information, they pull the age at which they want to have their first child younger. Okay? They say, oh
Right.
crap, I've been
Yeah.
lied to. Okay?
Yeah.
So, fertility education, there's already an explicit statutory authorization for it. The money is there. A conservative leader of DHHS under the Office of Population Affairs could do this. It's a great
There's an
idea.
Office of Population Affairs?
Yes, there is. More generally, getting a pronatalist at the head of the Office of Population Affairs who would
Oh my
responsibly
god,
and
what does the
professionally use
Office
it.
of Population Affairs do?
They promote contraception. They promote STI prevention. They also do have a marriage and fatherhood promotion program, I'll say, that was put in place under Bush Jr. Um, uh,
Okay.
but it's a very small budget line, that is. They do a number of things, but yes, having a pronatalist at the head of OPA um, uh, would be a really good thing. Now, you'd want a professional and responsible, and not one who's going to go hog wild and like abolish STI prevention programs like that.
Right.
Like this would both substantively this would be bad, and also politically that would be suicidally
Yeah, I
stupid.
don't think
Um,
that's the danger right now. We're no
but
longer in the
um,
days of
but
George Bush
having someone
Jr.
who will reasonably and moderately and winsomely promote, and by the way, I'm not talking about myself. I don't want it. I'm not moving to Washington D.C. So no, um, not a chance. Um, uh, but that would be important. Also thinking about regulatory stuff. Housing is really important. Yimbys want to like deregulate everything so we can have 87-story skyscrapers in every neighborhood. I don't want that. First of all, I think that kind of deregulation is politically toxic in a lot of America.
Yes.
Secondly, I have some worries that
This is another thing where you and I agree on, and the rest of the or not the world, but like pronatalist yimbies, which is hardly the world. It's like 12 guys, but if people who live in like studio apartments in 15-minute cities where everybody travels by bike don't have kids, even if their
yeah,
rent is
yeah.
lower than it would
So
otherwise be.
so I consider myself a Yimby. Okay, I'll say it. I'll cop to it. But um to me, the real crime is not that the top 5% densest neighborhoods aren't twice as dense. Okay.
Right.
To me, the real crime is that you've got all these suburban neighborhoods where if I go and I build a cottage for my mom, it's a crime.
Right.
Okay. Like it's my gosh darn property. I should be able to build an ADU. You're not stopping me. Okay. If I want to put one story more on my house, like I have the Second Amendment. Good luck stopping me. Okay. Like I just think it's insane that we take
Can
these.
I film the whole thing, by the way?
Yeah.
Can I?
I just think it's insane that we say to like homeowners in normal neighborhoods, it's not really your property. The little socialist across town gets to say you can't build on that. So I think what we need denser suburbs. And I want to say, I live in one. It's freaking awesome. I can walk to a library. I can walk to the post office. I can walk to
Yeah,
restaurants. I can
no,
walk to a
that's
grocery store. And also, I have a garage. I have a driveway. I have tons of street parking. I have a third of an acre lot with a huge flat yard and big trees for my kids. And you know what? I'm not in an expensive city. My house is not that expensive, all things considered. So, it can be done. I live in a top 10% density neighborhood, and yet it's suburbia. Why?
right,
Because it's a good, pleasant mixture of I
right,
have fully separated hiking and biking trails between the back of yards. Okay.
right.
And they are lovely tree lined trails. They're filled with kids on the weekend and families with strollers. I do wish I had a park a little bit closer. But regardless, like nothing about this is like the crazy urban idea. Like it's a very dense neighborhood, but it's clearly suburban. Like
Right.
it's tree lined streets with parking lot with garages, and the businesses all have parking lots. There's no crazy tall buildings. There's single family homes, there's duplexes, there's apartment buildings, there's townhouses, but they are pleasantly mixed with gentle density. And I think that is the path for America. Okay. And there are huge regulatory hurdles. My neighborhood, you could not build today in my city. The only neighborhoods you can build in my city now are these like apartment block
Yeah, I mean,
monstrosities where no one will ever have a
I take
child.
the point. I'm a moderate YIMBY. I'm like, because the prices are really becoming crazy. Like, it used to be just big
We
cities
have
and
to
stuff.
build.
Oh, by the way, Macron has made building illegal.
He really wants the French to go extinct, doesn't he? This is like his game plan.
I believe he does, and his electorate
Because
is
he got
boomers.
rid of
So,
like one of the big tax benefits for a lot of older or a lot of higher income families. And there was a nice
yep,
study showing that like their fertility just like immediately dropped.
yep,
Um, and he got rid of care credits, so he's punishing families in the long run for having kids. And he's not allowing building, so he's making sure young people have to live in their parents' basements.
yep,
Really a winning strategy.
yep. All right. So we talked a lot about policy, which I think is important because you have to spread the gospel that you can actually use policy to affect this. But you don't deny, and nobody denies, that culture also matters a
Yeah,
great deal.
yeah,
It's a false, dichotomy.
exactly.
Um, I guess, I mean,
Here,
we're not gonna do another hour on culture. I guess the question I wanted to ask is, let's say, you know, let's stop talking about like policy interventions. Let's say I give you a magic wand and like you can change one thing or maybe two things about American culture, Western culture. Like, what would be, you know, what or put differently, what's the biggest thing that's broken, or what's the biggest thing that would have to change, apart from a religious revival, which, yeah.
yeah, give me a magic wand and I say,
Yeah,
like,
make everybody a traditional Christian. Okay, fair
yeah, there
enough.
you go. But no, more plausibly, um, I would say convince young people that searching for and turning yourself into a good spouse is, in the sequence of life events, something you can and should do contemporaneously or before um, getting to stability in your career. The single idea that I would say, and again, I mentioned developmental idealism earlier, but it's basically a resequencing of the life course that says, no, the correct life course is job
Get
before
married
family.
first, and then, yeah.
Yeah. Prosperity as the root of the family or as the foundation of the family, rather than family as the foundation for prosperity. So I would say convince young people that their number one most important life progress task is transforming themselves into and identifying someone else who is a really good marriageable candidate. And so all that time they spend on studying for an exam or something like that, that they would weigh that, balance that, and also that wider society would support them in weighing that and balancing that against making yourself a good marriageable candidate, going on dates with people just to practice normal social interaction. Like, be more normal, people. So that is the one norm I would change. Failure of marriage is the central cause of failure of fertility. We have to address that. A big problem with that is basically the disordered life course around marriage, that leads to people marrying much later than they want to, and thus having way more trouble having kids than they expected, and thus experiencing a lot more disappointment and sadness than they anticipated, creating societies of faster and worse decline than they imagined. And I do want to mention there is this. You probably heard me go off about this at some point in the conference we were both at. People have this dichotomy between like cultural factors and material factors or economic factors or whatever. They're the same thing. Okay. Like, why is it that four of the five states with the highest rates of interracial marriage in the US are former slave states? It's because guess what? Changes in laws affect changes in cultures. Okay. Like,
Yep.
the law is a teacher. Like,
Yep.
the, if you pass laws that are more pronatal, you will get a more pronatal culture. Okay. And then if you get a more pronatal culture, you will get political support for more laws
Yep.
that are more pronatal. Okay. Like there's not like two forces that just like randomly bounce around in society. Like it's one thing. Okay. The things that are economically possible are mediated by what's culturally desirable and permissible. And the things that are culturally desirable and permissible are mediated by the things that are economically viable. There's
Yep.
not a separation between these. There's just one thing. And so saying, well, we could do that economically, but what can we do culturally? Like the economy is the culture. Now, also, I do think there are places where we could say, maybe instead of calling it a child tax credit, we should call it the family wage. Okay. Like it's compensation for the good work you're doing of raising children because society loves that. Okay. Alternatively, if you want to really sink fertility, maybe we call it like sad, pitiful welfare for families that really need it. Like, okay. Like, and that's what aid for families with dependent children was, or temporary assistance for needy
Right.
families.
Right.
We
Right.
have those
Right. Right.
programs. Okay. So like how you talk about programs matters. So I do think you shouldn't do stealth pronatalism. If a policymaker is
Yes.
enacting a
Yes.
policy
That's
that
a
they
very
hope
good
will
point.
boost fertility, they should say, one of our hopes with this is that this will make it easier for families, for people to have those families they so desire. Because family
Yes.
is
And
a
like
wonderful
that's the
thing
other
that
point, which is
almost
circling
everyone
back to the
wants.
beginning, which is people already want this.
People want this. You don't again, this is one of the things that drives me nuts. People are like, but how will we persuade people to we need to talk to people about the good, like we need to persuade people that children are good. No, you don't. People want kids so much, and when they don't get them, they are so sad. They
Yes.
know they
Yes.
want kids. They are failing to have them.
All right.
Okay? So it's not a persuasive task about the goodness of children. It's a task of mediating the cultural and economic obstacles, which are often the same thing. Okay. It's culturally not prioritized to have a partner. And the economy also makes it easier to culturally prioritize, to not culturally prioritize it. Because by the way, you suck as an economic candidate for marriage when you're 23, anyways. The cultural and the
Right.
economic logics ratify each other. So we need to tackle both of these because they're the same thing.
Okay. So great point to finish on. Let's own the fact that we want to be pronatalist. Certainly, if you look at the fertility numbers, that justifies it in a way that justifies having that conversation in a way that wasn't true maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Sure.
But I'm going to finish with our traditional question. And by traditional, I mean we started doing this last week. But we end every podcast and have done since time immemorial by asking you to recommend a book. It can be any book as long as it's not in your area of expertise. So fiction,
Oh,
nonfiction, whatever, but not something that's in your area of expertise.
oh man, I had one teed up, but it's in my area of expertise. Um,
See, otherwise it's too easy. And the
I mean, I'm
people
gonna
we
have to go
interview
with
are
a
interesting and
history
have
of some
wide
kind.
interest.
Um, but like the histories I like are all like in my area of expertise. Um, so this one, okay, I'm gonna say it's not in my area of expertise, even though I cite it as. But I recommend it to everyone because it's so good. Is Mabiki, which is a book about the Edo period in Japan, and it's really a book about Buddhism, the Edo period, value of life, infanticide. It is obliquely a book about demography. But the focus of the book is basically this like historic ethnography of
So
how did this society start killing half of
so
their
it's
children.
it's a book of history. It's not fiction.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
it's
did you say
titled what?
fiction?
No, I said
Oh
anything. I'm
yeah,
just
yeah,
asking.
yeah. It's called Mabiki,
Okay.
Mabiki.
Okay.
It's a good read. I highly recommend it. If you want fiction,
No,
um,
I want whatever you got.
yeah, I'm trying to think what fiction I've read recently. I feel like I just read something recently that I really liked, but I don't remember what it was. But so yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a very good anything is good. We're very inclusive with the answers of our to our last question. Well, anyway, thank you for being so generous with your time. Thank you for answering all those questions. I was absolutely right. This was the easiest interview ever. I could just have, blurted out natalism and then gone away and
You
done
could
my
have just gotten on like Claude or ChatGPT and been like, provide me with 1 hour of Lyman Stone content.
yeah, I could probably do that. No, but joking aside, this was great. This was very useful. I hope people get a lot of stuff out of it. I certainly did. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
Bye.